In Gravity Rush, you play as Kat, a girl who has lost her memory. Through the aid of her magical pet cat, Dusty, Kat discovers that she can manipulate gravity. Kat uses her newfound gravity powers to restore the missing parts of Hexville and recover her memories while defeating the mysterious creatures known as Nevi. Gravity Rush's gameplay is based entirely around Kat's ability to essentially change which way is down. You stop gravity and enter a float state, then choose which direction is down by using the crosshair and drop the float state. This means you can turn would-be walls into the new floor, letting you walk around the sides of buildings throughout Hexville. You also get an ability called the Gravity Slide, which allows you to make micro adjustments on the fly while moving forward. Unfortunately, these mechanics, while cool, are almost never utilized in any meaningful way. It's almost always better to fly by reorienting gravity to fall in your direction of choice. After a few upgrades, you're able to stay airborne virtually indefinitely with tactical use of falling up, then reorienting gravity to the normal position and having your power bar refill as you fall. Combat in general is pretty bland. All enemies must be defeated by attacking their glowing orange weak points. You have basic kicks on the ground, but you'll quickly realize it's not worth your time. Many enemies have weak points which are too hard to reach for Kat while on the ground. This makes flying around and using your gravity kick ability your bread and butter way of taking out every enemy. It can get boring as you're doing it for the game's entire runtime. Gravity Rush almost totally abandons ground combat in favor of aerial fighting after about the halfway mark. You get 3 special unlockable combat abilities and they do fare pretty well. They are tied to a timer and it takes a significant amount of time to recharge. These special attacks do have a tendency to miss as they're largely automatic. I would recommend the second one, the rock throw, as its fired projectiles seem to be the most reliable. In the main story, there are a handful of sections that remove or severely limit your gravity powers. These are some of the more interesting parts of the game. Again, unfortunately, they are so few and far between that it's hardly noteworthy. If you absolutely cannot stand anime in any way, shape, or form, then you will not like Gravity Rush. It's very anime-inspired from the art style, humor, and the presentation of the story. There's no English voice acting in any version, instead they opt for a made-up language. Just be aware of that fact going into it and you'll have to deal with subtitles. Most of the dialogue is pure text in the form of comic book style exposition. It works, but it always feels kind of lazy when games do it, and it's not really an exception here. I actually liked Gravity Rush's characters quite a bit. It does try and be funny, and I felt like a lot of the humor landed. It's very lighthearted in the beginning, but it doesn't take itself too seriously. A really unfortunate part of Gravity Rush is that nothing plot related goes anywhere. Many plot threads are introduced only to wind up being totally sidelined immediately after for the next plot line. There are some cool aspects related to the theoretical side of gravity, such as its influence on time, but like everything else, it's totally glossed over to make way for the next plot thread. It is incredibly unsatisfying for nothing to get resolved. Gravity Rush really just starts to get interesting as you're quite literally seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes, then it just throws the final mission at you and it's all over. It doesn't even feel like sequel baiting, it just feels like they had no idea where they wanted the story to go, or they just ran out of development time to actually finish the game. A few of the music tracks stood out, mostly the Pleasure Quarter and some of Raven's themes. The rest of the soundtrack is decent, but kind of forgettable. I found the interface to be clumsy to navigate. It can be annoying to set your markers where you want to go, and having to go into the menu to set your current objective after every mission was a bit annoying. Gravity Rush is a moderate difficulty curve with some questionable spikes. There is definitely a learning curve at the start with getting used to the controls and the feelings of vertigo associated with the movement mechanics. After the initial hurdle, you kind of get into a groove and things feel pretty appropriate, especially after some upgrades to your gravity powers which make the world traversal a lot more forgiving. Most of the combat is pretty easy, but it takes a good amount of time simply because of the way you have to awkwardly position yourself to set up gravity kicks. Ground combat is significantly worse than spamming gravity kicks, and rendered impossible for the latter half of the game as most combat takes place in the air. Many enemies will have shields, or only have brief opportunities to hit their weak points with gravity kicks. It can be really annoying to clear enemies out as you have short windows to get the kicks off, and frequently I was just a little too slow or too far away and the enemies would stop being vulnerable by the time I got there. Other enemies will fire projectiles directly at you, which are hard to dodge when you've initiated a gravity kick towards them. Even with a focus on upgrading gravity kicks, they still feel weak. Rarely did it feel like upgrading the power of gravity kicks made it take less hits to kill an enemy. Since it's nearly impossible to keep track of everything on screen at the start of battles, you will regularly get hit by projectiles seemingly from nowhere. It was annoying and frequently made me miss gravity kicks. At the very end of the game, I conceded to mostly just using my special abilities and dodging around until they recharged. It made things safe, but also very boring. Your only real combat options in the air are your special abilities and the gravity kick, so it does feel restrictive. Everything is competent in Gravity Rush. The camera works, and the gravity manipulation powers work, so there's little issue with the technical aspect of the game. It's just the gameplay itself leads to a lot of getting hit from off-screen because of design choices. It's very difficult to keep track of every enemy at the start of fights, especially against multiple flying enemies. This leads to a lot of getting smacked from off-screen projectiles before you can thin out the numbers to actually keep track of everything. I had very few issues with Gravity Rush until I reached about the midway point where there was 2 difficult missions back to back. These sections felt way more difficult than any other part of the game, and they really marred the experience. It's strange because they're almost dead in the middle of the game, and the difficulty never approaches these 2 sections ever again. The first was the tower. It's the first part of the game where you have to deal with a lot of airborne enemies and projectiles. It did feel a bit out of the blue, as everything up to that point was pretty easy. Then the second fight with Raven felt borderline impossible in the intended way of falling quickly to dodge her attacks. I had to resort to a slow and unsatisfying strategy of throwing myself across the ravine to the next outcropping of cover. Doing all 21 main missions, a handful of the optional missions, and some minor exploration around Hexville, Gravity Rush Remastered was completed in 7 hours, 7 minutes, and 40 seconds. The main missions have adequate pacing, but as I stated earlier, none of the many plotlines have any reasonable conclusion. If you want, you can take the game a lot slower and engage in a plethora of the optional missions. Most of them have a set formula. You have to buy into the challenge by throwing crystals into machinery around Hexville. Then you gain access to whatever the challenge is. The challenges have some okay diversity. It's either combat or a race where you have to hit all the waypoints under a time crunch. Some have different parameters, like being forced to defeat enemies by only throwing objects and your standard combat abilities are locked out, or being forced to use the gravity slide for your movement instead of your normal abilities. Rewards from these side missions are quite lucrative. There are 3 reward tiers, which incentivizes replaying the missions to get the higher rewards. Some missions, specifically the races, will be strictly impossible to get the top scores without replaying, as they often have unintuitive routes. This goes for the combat challenges as well, where many will feel impossible to gold medal without a lot of combat upgrades. Doing all the optional missions and the included DLC missions in the remastered version will provide a lot more content for those who enjoy the mechanics or are looking for 100% completion. Gravity Rush's gravity mechanics are interesting and fun. They do get a little dull as the game progresses, as you stay with your core ability set for the entire game. The mechanics are also a bit underutilized, and the game largely encourages you to just fly rather than try to use the powers to actually interact with the environment. There are a few sections that have questionable difficulty spikes. There are 2 sections that have difficulty that feels out of place and really mar the experience. It can be really frustrating to be hit from enemy projectiles from off-screen while trying to clumsily orient yourself for the aerial combat. There's no doubt that if you took the time to get good at Gravity Rush's combat, that there is a decently high skill ceiling. Gravity Rush definitely borders on the line between a recommendation or not. It does enough unique, with some novel mechanics to justify a playthrough, but don't be surprised for an abrupt end with no answers and 0 plot threads being resolved. Gravity Rush gets recommended playing's most prestigious verdict of recommended.